Hey there, welcome back. Tonight, I invite you to step back in time. No grand battles, no royal courts, just the quiet crackle of a village oven and the steady hands of a medieval baker preparing for another long day. Before we begin, feel free to dim your lights. Maybe light a candle or just close your eyes and let your imagination settle in. If you enjoy these gentle explorations into the past, go ahead and subscribe. And in the comments, tell me, what time is it where you are? Now, let's open our eyes in the year 1374. It's still dark. The stars are fading behind a layer of low clouds, and the smell of ash lingers in the cool, damp air. Inside a small stone cottage near the edge of the village, a baker named Elric stirs. He's been up for hours already, because bread, like time, waits for no one. He stretches his arms, bones cracking softly like twigs underfoot. His sleeping mat is little more than coarse wool and straw. Nearby, in a corner of the room, lies a bundle of cloth, where his youngest son sleeps curled like a kitten, beside the family's goat. The hearth glows faintly. He banked the coals last night under ash, and with a few practiced motions, he breathes life back into the fire. The flame answers with a sleepy flicker, then grows. He places a heavy iron pot nearby to heat water, and checks the dough he left rising in a wooden trough beneath the cloth. It's risen well, not too fast, not too slow. The yeast, borrowed from yesterday's leaven, has done its work. Elric's hands, rough from years of kneading, begin to move in a rhythm older than memory. Flour, water, salt, simple ingredients, sacred in their way. Each movement is deliberate, respectful, not rushed. Outside, the village begins to stir. A rooster calls from somewhere down the lane. Smoke slips from neighboring chimneys, and the dull clank of a smith's hammer echoes in the distance. Life is waking up. But the baker is already deep into his world. He works in silence, occasionally humming an old tune his mother used to sing, a song of warmth, of rain, of golden grain. The oven is the heart of this place. It takes hours to heat and longer still to cool. Built from stones carried from the nearby river and sealed with mud and straw, it looks more like a small hill than anything crafted by hand. But inside, it holds heat like a dragon. Elric feeds the fire slowly, carefully. Oak and ash, dried well, stacked just so. Not too much, not too fast. The village will come soon. Mothers with children, farmers with aching backs, merchants who've walked since dawn. They'll come with coins or eggs or promises, and Elric will offer what he has. Loaves shaped with care, baked with quiet devotion. Bread is more than food here. It is life. It is communion. It is the difference between another day and an empty belly. And in this little bakery, as the first rays of sunlight touch the cobbled street, life continues, warm, slow, steady, just as it has for generations. Soft fade-in of gentle crackling fire, distant laughter of children beginning to wake. We'll continue soon with how Elric deals with flour shortages, the social role of bakers, and the secret behind medieval communal ovens. But for now, breathe deep, and let the simplicity of this forgotten world wrap around you like a wool cloak. You're safe here, and there's so much more to discover. The smell of warm yeast fills the room now, mingling with the earthy scent of firewood and damp stone. Elric gently shapes the dough into small, rounded loaves. Some he scores with a simple mark, a cross, a diagonal slash. Each cut helping the bread expand, rise, breathe. He wipes flour onto his apron and steps outside, stretching his back and shoulders as the morning mist clings low to the ground. His eyes scan the road for the village messenger. Sometimes he brings news of new taxes, of plague outbreaks, or worse, of grain shortages. For now, the world feels still. Elric walks to the communal oven across the village square. His home oven is for small batches and family bread, but the large stone beehive at the heart of the village is where most loaves find their final fire. The oven stands beside the well. It's round and dome-shaped, darkened with soot, and warm even in the morning air. Its door, just a flat slab of wood reinforced with iron, is propped open as the baker from the neighbouring house, Marta, rakes the ashes from her early bake. They nod to one another without words. Bakers speak in gestures, in the rhythm of routine. A nod means the fire held through the night. A shrug means the dough collapsed. A small smile means, for once, things went as planned. Elric waits his turn, loading his loaves onto a long-handled peel, a flat wooden board shaped like a paddle. The heat from the oven stings his face, but he knows this heat. He trusts it. One by one, the loaves disappear into the belly of the oven. The door is closed. The fire, banked to the sides, radiates inward, baking the bread slowly from all directions. And now, he waits. He sits on a nearby stone, rubbing his fingers. They're stiff this morning. Maybe the cold, maybe the years. While the loaves bake, he chats softly with Marta. They speak of weather, of a cow that wandered too far, of how the priest's sermon yesterday ran so long, even the goats began to complain. They speak of grain. Elric's store is running low. The last harvest was poor. Rain came late, and the miller's wheel broke halfway through the season. Everyone's flour is a little darker this year, a little coarser. Some say it's been mixed with ground peas or beans. Others worry it's stretched with ash or even chalk. He sighs. Bakers don't complain loudly, but they carry worry like flour, clinging, subtle, impossible to wash off completely.
Still, he smiles faintly when he smells the crust begin to form. A toasty, nutty aroma drifting out from the oven's seams. Soon, it will be time to take the loaves out, but not yet. He knows the moment. He's learned to listen, not with ears, but with instinct. Children begin to appear near the well. They wait with small cloth bundles, trading chicken's eggs or helping hands for a crust of warm bread. Elric always keeps a few extra loaves for them. Hunger shows in small shoulders and wide eyes. He won't say no. Back at the oven, he opens the door. Steam escapes in a golden puff. The loaves are ready. He draws them out one by one, tapping the bottom of each with his knuckle, a hollow sound. It means done. He lays them out on a woven mat, letting them cool slightly. Marta leans over, inhales and raises her brow. Still the best in the village, she says with a grin. Elric laughs softly. Not the boastful kind, just enough to feel human again. He gathers his bread into a sack, thanks the fire with a gentle pat to the oven wall, and begins the slow walk back home. The day has just begun, but already something essential has been created, not just food, but warmth, connection, rhythm and care. And tomorrow it will begin again. We'll continue in the next part with what role bread played in social life, the dangers of being accused of dishonest baking, and how bakers were once regulated by kings. But for now, let the quiet courage of Elric guide you to rest. Breathe in, breathe out. The bread is warm. The fire is steady. You're safe. Elric returns home just as the sun begins to warm the stone walls of the village. He places the fresh loaves onto a wooden shelf near the window, if you could call the small skin-covered opening a window at all. His wife, Anith, is already awake, her hands deep in cold water as she washes yesterday's linens with lye soap and river stones. She doesn't ask about the bake. She can tell by the smell, the posture of her husband, the way he moves. It was a good morning. Their youngest stirs again. The goat bleats softly. Anith breaks one of the smaller loaves and hands half to the boy. He bites into it with a kind of reverence only children possess, a joy that forgets hunger the moment it is satisfied. Elric sits, finally, and takes his own piece of bread. It is dense, yes, a little sour from the leaven. The crust is harder than most would prefer today, but here, now, it is perfect. Later that morning, villagers begin to pass by. A shepherd trades a ball of wool for 2 loaves. A widow offers a jar of sour berries. Elric never measures transactions by fairness alone. Need speaks louder than coins. By midday, he has only a few loaves left. He wraps them carefully in cloth, places them in a small wicker basket, and sets off toward the manor house. The Lord Steward expects fresh bread every 3rd day. It's not a law, but an understanding, one that keeps peace and preserves what little independence Elric has. The manor is larger than most buildings in the village, with thick stone walls and a timbered 2nd floor. Guards at the gate nod him through. They know him. Inside the kitchen, he delivers the loaves to the steward, who grunts, weighs them with his hands, and says nothing. Elric doesn't linger. He's learned not to. As he walks back home, the warmth of midday fades into the stillness of afternoon. He thinks of the fines imposed on bakers in the city, how in some towns, a loaf found too light or too small could cost a man a day's wages. Some were even dragged to the stocks, their faces pelted with spoiled vegetables by angry customers. Here in the village, trust is everything. There are no official scales, no records, only memory. Only reputation that evening. Elric tends to his tools, wiping down the wooden trough, checking the cloth he uses to cover the rising dough. Flour is running low. He'll need to speak with the miller tomorrow, or perhaps offer to trade his help in turning the wheel in exchange for a sack. As dusk settles, he watches his children chase each other through the yard, their laughter the only light louder than the dimming sky. Dinner is simple. Soup made from onions, beans, and a heel of yesterday's bread. No one complains. They eat together, heads bowed, hands close. Later, Elric sits by the hearth, not speaking, just staring into the flames. He thinks of his father, who baked with the same wooden peel, who once told him, bread makes peace where words fail. He wonders if anyone will remember him, not as a great man, not as a hero.
Night settles fully over the village. The last of the smoke curls into the dark sky, and most homes have gone quiet. Only the occasional bark of a distant dog or the shuffle of livestock reminds Elric that the world is still gently breathing. He lies on his mat, staring at the low ceiling beams above. The room is still, save for the rhythmic breathing of his family, curled under shared blankets, finding warmth in closeness. But sleep does not come easily tonight. His thoughts drift toward the next week. There are rumors. A new tithe might be collected. The church needs repairs. The Lord is marrying off a cousin, and gifts are expected from each household, even the poorest. Flour, wine, meat, things Elric doesn't have. He wonders how much more he can stretch the sacks of grain, how thin the dough can be before it stops becoming bread. He closes his eyes and tries to count the days since the last festival. Michaelmas had passed in silence. No feast this year, no roasted goose or jugs of ale, just quiet prayers and the cold creeping in. At dawn, he rises before the others. The morning is colder now. He can feel it in his bones. He cracks his knuckles and winces. His hands, once strong and quick, are slower now, but still they move. Out of habit, out of duty, out of something deeper. He mixes a small batch of dough, less than usual. There's not enough flour to bake for the entire village today, but he'll make what he can. He always does. As he kneads, he hears the church bell ring once, slow, solemn. A signal. Someone has died. He doesn't stop kneading. He just lowers his head for a moment. He doesn't ask who. In a village this size, he'll find out soon enough. Death is never far here. It comes quietly, sometimes in the night, sometimes behind a cough, sometimes in the stillness between harvests. But bread must still be made. By mid-morning, A small line has formed outside his door. People whisper softly, out of respect. They carry baskets, empty hands, or nothing at all. Elric opens his door. His eyes are tired, but his voice is gentle. He doesn't turn anyone away. A woman with 3 children offers a wooden spoon in exchange for a loaf. Elric nods. He knows her husband fell ill last spring. She hasn't smiled in months. An old man places a pouch of dried herbs on the table. He walks with a limp. "For your knees," he says quietly. Elric nods again. When the bread is gone, he sits down and counts what's left. Not much, but somehow it is enough. That afternoon, he walks alone to the edge of the village where the fields lie bare. The earth is hard, cold, resting. He kneels, presses his fingers into the dirt, and murmurs something too quiet for anyone to hear. Maybe it's a prayer. Maybe it's a promise. And then he rises, brushes off his hands, and walks home. His steps slow, his eyes steady. Tomorrow, he will bake again. The next morning brings rain. It isn't heavy, just a soft, persistent drizzle that coats everything in a thin sheen of grey. The rooftops glisten. The muddy road shines like a winding ribbon. And in Elric's workshop, the damp air clings to the wooden beams, making everything feel heavier. He opens the shutters just slightly, enough to let in a dim light. The fire takes longer to catch today, but eventually it comes to life. And with it, the comforting rhythm of another bake begins. Elric hums to himself while mixing, a song his grandmother used to sing during storms. Something about apples and saints and the smell of bread. He doesn't remember the words, just the tune, just the feeling. Today's flour is coarser than usual. The miller had no choice. The grain was damp from storage. It grinds unevenly and bits of husk remain. Elric frowns slightly, but says nothing. He works with what he has. By mid-morning, Anith appears in the doorway holding a folded scrap of parchment. It's a notice from the steward. A request? No, a demand. 10 extra loaves for the manor. By week's end, no compensation. No grain in return. Just a cold order written in neat ink. Elric reads it twice, then folds it and sets it aside. Anith doesn't ask what it said. She sees the tightness in his shoulders, the quiet in his breath. He increases the batch, measuring out the last of the flour, scraping the bottom of the sack with careful hands. He adds a little more water, stretches the dough. It will rise thinner. The crust will be harder, but it will feed. Outside, puddles begin to form near the door. The children splash through them, chasing each other with sticks, laughter echoing off the stone. And still, Elric kneads. When the dough is ready, he carries it once again to the communal oven. The square is quieter than usual. Most villagers are indoors, escaping the rain. Only Marta waits near the oven, her cloak pulled tight, hair damp beneath her scarf. "You got one too?" she asks, without looking up. Elric nods. They don't speak again. Inside the oven, the fire burns low. Elric feeds it slowly, allowing the heat to rise evenly. He's careful today, too careful maybe, but he knows these loaves must not burn. Not now. When the bread is ready, he doesn't take any home. All of it goes to the manor. The steward does not thank him. On the way back, Elric passes the widow from yesterday. She sits on a stool under an awning, peeling onions into a wooden bowl. He gives her a small pouch of dried herbs. She looks up, surprised. "For your boy," he says simply. She nods, tears welling in her eyes, but she does not cry. People here are used to holding things in. That evening, as the family eats a thin soup of cabbage and garlic, the room feels quieter than usual. Elric doesn't speak much, but when his daughter leans against his arm and whispers, "Your bread smelled good today," he smiles. A real smile. And for a moment, the weight of the day softens. Just a little. The days grow shorter. Autumn is slipping quietly into winter, and the wind carries with it the scent of frost and wood smoke. The fields outside the village lie still, harvested, emptied, waiting for snow. Elric rises earlier now, not because he must, but because sleep grows thinner with the cold. The air bites at his fingers as he stokes the fire, but he welcomes the burn. It reminds him he's still here. The flour is nearly gone. Only a small cloth bundle remains, tucked high on a shelf away from moisture. It's enough for a half batch, maybe less. Aneth doesn't ask what he plans to do. They both know the answer. He mixes what he has, carefully, gently, as if the dough might vanish if handled too roughly. He adds crushed barley to stretch the volume, and a pinch of salt saved from market week. No more herbs, no more leaven from yesterday. The last bit was given to a neighbour who lost their own. The dough is heavy, slow to rise. Elric wraps it in cloth and sets it near the hearth. Then he waits. Outside, the village is quiet. Even the children have gone still. It's too cold to play, too early for chores. The world has settled into the hush that only winter brings. By midday, he steps outside with the shaped loaves, only 4 today, and makes his way, once more, to the communal oven. To his surprise, he finds it already warm. Marta has come before him. She's left a note, scrawled in charcoal on a bit of old parchment. "Take the heat. I'm out of flour." Elric pauses. He places the loaves into the oven, his movements slower now. He watches the flames, not for baking, but for warmth, for something to hold on to. When the bread is done, he keeps one loaf. The others he delivers without being asked. One to the widow with the onions, one to Marta, and one to the shepherd, whose youngest daughter hasn't been seen in days. He returns home with only the smallest piece of crust in his satchel. That night, dinner is thin again. The soup barely covers the bottom of the pot. The children are quiet, chewing slowly. Aneth hums an old tune under her breath, as if to distract from the hunger. Elric listens. He closes his eyes. He doesn't need much. Just enough to last the winter. Just enough to keep the oven warm. And maybe, just maybe, enough to help someone else do the same. Winter has arrived. The first snow fell quietly overnight, blanketing the village in a soft, cold white. The trees stand bare, their branches etched sharply against the pale sky. The air is crisp, each breath visible as a fleeting cloud. Elric wakes before dawn. The chill is sharper now, seeping even through thick woolen blankets. He dresses slowly, careful not to wake his family. At the hearth, he stokes the dying embers, coaxing flames to life. The fire crackles hesitantly, but grows stronger with patience. The flour is gone. There is no more to be found. He sits, hands wrapped around a cup of cold water, staring into the fire. The village waits, as always. Elric knows the winter will be hard. There will be days with no bread, no warm meals, just cold and hunger. But there is something else, a quiet determination that keeps him going. He recalls his father's words. The oven's warmth is not just fire, Elric. It's hope. Hope is what he carries now. With slow, steady hands, he begins to prepare a thin gruel, water, crushed barley, a pinch of salt. It is humble. It is meager. But it is life. Outside, the wind moans softly through the village streets. Inside, Elric tends the fire, listens to the soft breathing of his children, and whispers a prayer for the coming dawn. The bread may be gone, but the spirit endures. The days stretch long and cold. Elric spends much of his time repairing tools, patching the worn leather of his sacks, and tending the small fire that stubbornly fights the chill. Occasionally, neighbors stop by. Quiet visits exchanged through shared glances and small offerings of dried herbs or salted pork. Words are few. Survival has taught them to conserve energy and hope. One afternoon, a soft knock echoes at the door. It's Marta, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Without a word, she places it on the table. A handful of cracked grain, enough to start a new batch. Elric looks up, gratitude warm in his eyes. "We must help each other," she says simply. Together, they plan a bake. Shared labor, shared reward. This is how the village survives, not through abundance, but through quiet acts of kindness. Elric's hands, stiff and worn, knead the dough with renewed purpose. The fire blazes brighter, and for a moment, the cold fades. The village begins to stir again as the faint light of dawn filters through frost-covered windows. Elric rises with the soft resolve that has carried him through many winters. Today, the shared flour has been mixed, and the dough is rising in a large wooden trough, covered carefully with a warm cloth. The warmth from the hearth encourages it slowly, steadily. Elric tends the fire, feeding it small pieces of dry wood saved from earlier in the season. The flames dance softly, casting gentle shadows on the stone walls. As the bread bakes in the communal oven, the village gathers nearby. It's a quiet assembly, a testament to resilience and community. Children watch eagerly, hoping for a taste. Mothers exchange whispered stories. Elders nod approvingly. Elric feels the weight of their trust, a responsibility heavier than any sack of flour. The first loaf is pulled from the oven, golden and warm. Its scent drifts through the cold air, a small beacon of comfort. He breaks the bread carefully, sharing pieces with those who need it most. Though times remain hard, moments like these kindle a fragile hope. And as the fire crackles softly, Elric knows that life, even in the harshest winters, finds a way to endure. As the days pass, the winter deepens. Snow blankets the village in silence, muffling footsteps and softening the edges of the world. Elric's hands are raw and cracked from the cold, but still he works. The rhythm of kneading dough is a balm to his spirit, a small act of control in an unpredictable world. He reflects on the many seasons he has seen, harsh winters and bountiful springs, and understands that endurance is less about strength and more about quiet persistence. At times, he finds himself sitting by the hearth late into the night, staring into the flickering flames, thinking of the future. What will become of the village come spring? Will the fields yield enough grain? Will his children remember warmth and safety? He doesn't have answers, only hope. And that is enough to keep the fire burning. The snow came heavier that week. It fell in slow, endless drifts, softening the thatched roofs and turning narrow dirt paths into quiet, frozen veins winding between homes. The village was nearly silent now. Movement stilled, voices hushed, breath visible in every word. Elric had long since stopped counting the days. Time, in winter, lost its edges. The sun hung low, barely warming the horizon, before retreating again behind a curtain of clouds. Each morning began in darkness and ended the same. Inside the cottage, life had narrowed into simple rituals. Feeding the fire, checking on stored root vegetables, portioning out the last dried herbs, and wrapping the children in every spare scrap of wool. The routine gave shape to otherwise shapeless days. The bread was thinner now. He had taken to grinding dried acorns, mixing them with coarse flour from the last shared batch. The result was bitter and dense, but it held together in the fire, and it fed. Aneth had found ways to stretch every meal. Soups flavoured with boiled onion peels, crushed lentils left over from autumn. Elric watched her quietly as she worked, how she moved with a kind of dignity, even when offering so little. The children were learning too. His eldest, Marek, had started helping with the mixing. At first, his motions were clumsy, impatient, but now he listened. He watched the dough, not just the clock. He was learning what Elric's father once taught him, that bread was more than food. It was memory, memory made with hands. One evening, as the wind howled outside and the shutters creaked, Elric found a single egg tucked behind a basket of grain husks, likely laid by the last remaining hen, who had stopped producing weeks ago. He didn't call out. He simply held it in his hand for a long time. An egg was a treasure. He placed it gently on the shelf near the hearth, not ready to use it. Not yet. Not until someone truly needed it. The next morning, the widow Marta came to the door, her eyes red with cold and grief. Her youngest had passed in the night. Elric didn't speak. He stepped aside, brought out a small round loaf, and placed the egg, still whole, uncracked, into her hands. Marta held it as if it were gold. Later that day, when he returned to the oven, he found that someone had already cleaned the ash. Firewood had been left near the entrance, neatly stacked, dry. A quiet thank you, a return of kindness. In this season of lack, generosity was the most sacred form of wealth. That night, Elric sat by the fire, his son sleeping against his shoulder. The wind had softened, and the snow had stopped. Through the narrow window, the stars had begun to return, and for the first time in weeks, the night did not feel so heavy. A few days later, the first thaw whispered its way into the village. It didn't come loudly. No sudden melting, no torrents of water, just a subtle shift in the way the air moved. The frost on the window panes was thinner that morning. The icicles hanging from the thatch dripped, one silent drop at a time. Elric noticed it as he stirred the fire. The logs hissed slightly, drawing moisture from the air. Outside, the snow was still thick, but softer now. Less a wall, more a blanket waiting to be folded away. The change was small, but it was enough. He stepped outside, drawing his heavy cloak close around him. His boots crunched over the slush, past the well, past the silent church, toward the fields, beyond the village edge. The ground was still hard, still resisting, but somewhere beneath it, life was waiting. He knelt by the nearest fence post and pressed a hand into the soil, still frozen, but not for long. Returning home, he found Marek repairing one of the wooden kneading troughs, sanding the cracked edge smooth with a stone. Elric watched him for a moment before joining in. Together, they worked in silence. Wood dust mingled with the scent of old flour and smoke. In the afternoon, Marta came by, her eyes still tired, but her shoulders straighter than before. She brought a cloth bundle, dried mushrooms, gathered in the woods before the snow. "You'll know when to use them," she said simply. That night, Aneth placed one mushroom into the stew. Its rich, earthy scent filled the small room, and for a few moments, everyone just sat still, breathing it in. Elric smiled at her over the flames. She nodded once, not speaking. Some feelings were older than words. After dinner, he retrieved an old tin box from beneath the bed, the one that held his father's notes. Not many, just a few faded scraps. A sketch of a hand-built oven, a list of herbs that helped preserve flour, a half-written poem about barley fields. He laid them on the table for Marek to see. These were his, Elric said softly. Your grandfather's. Marek ran his fingers over the drawings, his eyes wide. Did he teach you everything? No, Elric said, but he showed me how to learn. They stayed there, the two of them, heads bent over parchment, while the fire faded to coals and the wind whispered softly against the walls. In the corner, the hen stirred. In her straw nest lay another egg, the promise of spring. Morning came with a sky the colour of pale stone, neither bright nor heavy, just still. A thin mist clung to the edges of the village like a secret, wrapping itself around fences, rooftops and trees without leaves. Elric stepped outside quietly, careful not to wake the children. The air was different again. Not warm, no, but softer. The kind of cold that no longer stung. The roads were turning to mud now, thick and slow, sucking at boots with each step. But it was welcome. After months of ice and silence, even the mess of thawing earth felt like a kind of joy. He walked to the communal oven and ran his hand along the stones, damp, darkened with last night's dew. He'd need to light the fire again today, even if he had no flour to bake. There was something sacred about keeping the oven warm. It wasn't just about bread anymore. It was a sign, to the villagers, to himself, that they were still here, still together. By midday, others had begun to gather again. Marta, wrapped in an old wool cloak with 2 borrowed buttons. A young couple from the south end of the village, their first winter together written in the tired lines under their eyes. And Tomlin, the miller's boy, whose hands were always stained with flour, even when there was none to grind. They brought kindling, bark, dry twigs. One woman offered a handful of salt, another 2 cracked bowls. The fire, like the community, was being rebuilt with pieces. Elric crouched near the hearth and began stacking wood. Marek joined him, unasked. He no longer needed instruction. When the flames rose, flickering gold against the grey afternoon, someone began to hum. A tune old as the hills, with no real words. Others joined softly. It wasn't a song for celebration. It was a song for returning. That evening, Elric and Anith shared a thin porridge with the children. He added one of the last mushrooms, sliced fine. Even the scent lifted their spirits. The food was humble, but the warmth it brought was not. Later, after the children had gone to sleep, Elric took a walk alone. The moon was rising, pale and full. Its light caught on patches of melting snow. He walked to the edge of the barley field, where the earth was still asleep. He crouched, touched the ground again, softer now. He stayed there for a long time, not praying, not wishing, just being. When he returned home, Anith was waiting near the hearth, sewing a patch onto Marek's tunic. I think it's time, he said quietly. For what? She asked, though she already knew. To start the leaven again. Her smile was small, but it reached her eyes. Tomorrow, they would grind what little grain they had left. Tomorrow, they would mix water, flour, and thyme. Tomorrow, the bread would begin again. The next morning began quietly, as most did, but with a different kind of silence. Not the muffled hush of snow or the solemn stillness of loss, but a silence full of waiting, like a breath held between notes. The kind of stillness that exists just before something begins. Elric stood at the table, sleeves rolled up, hands dusted with flour. Before him sat a small wooden bowl with just enough grain to start the leaven. It was coarse, barely sifted, and mixed with ground-dried peas to stretch it. But it would do. He poured water slowly, stirring with the patience of someone who had done this for decades. The mixture was thick, heavy and quiet. It didn't bubble, not yet. But that wasn't the point. He placed the bowl near the hearth, close enough to catch the fire's warmth, and covered it with cloth. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. Anith watched from the corner, eyes resting gently on the bowl, as if watching a cradle. Outside, the ground had thawed enough that the children could play again. Their boots kicked up slush and mud, their laughter returning slowly, like birds in early spring. They no longer asked when the snow would end. They could feel the answer beneath their feet. By midday, Elric visited Marta's home. He brought with him a split loaf from yesterday's flourless bake, half lentil, half oat, heavy but nourishing. She opened the door with red cheeks and calloused hands. In her arms, a new lamb, born 2 days earlier, its legs still awkward, eyes impossibly wide. "Spring comes when it's ready," she said softly. Elric nodded. "And not a day before." He returned home just as the sun broke through the clouds. For a moment, only a moment, the world was gold. Later that evening, Marek crouched beside the hearth, peering at the bowl where the leaven sat. "Nothing's happening," he murmured. Elric smiled faintly. "It never does at first. But how do we know it's working? You don't. You wait, and you trust." Marek looked unconvinced, but nodded. That night, they slept with the fire low and the shutters open just a crack. The air no longer bit their skin. It simply reminded them it was there. Elric dreamt of barley fields, endless and swaying in summer wind. His father stood in the center, smiling without speaking, hands deep in golden grain. When he woke, the fire had burned down to embers, but the smell in the room had changed, sour, alive. He rose, walked to the bowl, and lifted the cloth. Bubbles, small, barely there signs of life, but real. The leaven had caught. The bread would rise again, and with it, everything else. The village awoke that day with a hum beneath the cold. It wasn't sound exactly, but something else. A stirring, a knowing, like soil softening beneath snow, or sap beginning to rise within trees still bare. Spring had not yet arrived, but it was near enough to believe in. Elric spent the early morning tending the leaven. It had doubled in size overnight, an airy, bubbling promise. He stirred it gently, added a little more flour and water, and returned it to the hearth's edge. It gave off a sour warmth, sharp but comforting, the smell of things beginning again. Outside, birds had returned to the trees along the village path. Not many, but enough to break the winter's long silence with soft, uncertain songs. At midday, he met Tomlin by the mill house. "The wheel creaked last night," Tomlin said, wiping flour dust onto his apron. "First time since December." Elric raised an eyebrow. "Water flowing again?" Tomlin shrugged. "Just a trickle." But it moved. That was enough. They spoke for a while, not about grain or baking, but about other things. Marta's lambs, the butcher's daughter who planned to marry in June, the price of salt at last market, life creeping in through the seams. Later that day, Elric measured out what little flour remained and began preparing his first proper batch in weeks. Marek stood beside him, eyes sharp, movements careful. The boy didn't speak much anymore, but his hands were steady, sure. Together, they mixed and folded and shaped the dough. The texture was coarse but forgiving, the surface smooth under their palms. Anith watched them from the bench near the window, sewing a patch onto the youngest child's tunic. Her fingers moved automatically, but her gaze stayed on the bread. When the dough was shaped, Elric wrapped it gently and let it rest. He set a stone on top of the wooden lid, not for pressure, but to remind the children not to touch it. Bread needs silence, he'd always said, and time. By dusk, the sky had shifted. The clouds thinned, letting through a soft wash of violet and gold. Smoke curled from chimneys across the village, slow and lazy, no longer desperate. At the communal oven, a small group had gathered, not with the hunger of winter, but with something gentler, curiosity, fellowship. They brought small bundles, a pouch of wild garlic, a few dried apples, a cracked jar of last summer's honey. Barter, yes, but also gestures of shared relief. The fire was lit, the stones warmed, the bread slid in. As it baked, Elric sat nearby, watching the flames. His shoulders relaxed, his breath slowed. When the loaf emerged, golden, firm, smelling of yeast and ash and new beginnings, no one clapped, no one cheered. They simply nodded and broke it, and shared it, piece by piece, in silence and in gratitude. The season was not over, but it had turned. The days lengthened, almost imperceptibly at first. Shadows now stretched a little further in the evenings, and the cold air carried the faintest scent of damp earth. The snow, once high and stubborn, had thinned into quiet patches, clinging in corners, shrinking beneath trees. In the distance, water flowed again, trickling softly through narrow streams. Elric woke to the sound of birdsong, not just a lonely chirp, but a chorus, hesitant and sweet, like the first few notes of a forgotten melody. He stood at the window, holding a cracked mug of barley tea, and let the sound settle into him. The house was still asleep. Marek curled under a heavy cloak near the hearth. The others snuggled together on the low bedding, their breath slow and warm. There was no need to rush. He savoured the quiet, then stepped outside to breathe the morning. Mud pulled at his boots, and mist hung low over the ground. But the air tasted different now, fresher. There was life beneath the muck. Seeds slept in the soil, waiting only for warmth and a little time. Later, in the workshop, he prepared another batch of dough. The leaven had strengthened. Each day, its scent grew deeper, richer. A good sign. He split it carefully, setting some aside for the next day. Bread required discipline and patience. As he kneaded, the door creaked open. Anith entered, holding a bundle wrapped in cloth. "For you," she said, placing it beside the trough. Inside were fresh eggs, 3 of them. A gift from Marta, whose hens had begun laying again. Elric looked up. "We should keep them for the children." "We will, but use one today. Just one." He hesitated, then nodded. With practiced hands, he cracked the egg into the mixture. Its yolk glowed like gold, bright and whole. He folded it into the dough, watching as it transformed, richer, smoother, more alive. Outside, laughter echoed. Children ran along the edge of the fields, sticks in hand, mud on their boots. Their joy was loud, careless, free. He smiled to himself. At the oven, he met Tomlin again. The boy was older now, though only a few months had passed. He stood straighter, spoke with more certainty. Together, they fed the fire, arranged the loaves, and waited. As they did, villagers gathered, not in desperation, but in habit, in community. Someone brought a fiddle. Another clapped softly in rhythm. Someone began to hum. By the time the bread emerged, the sun was low, casting long, warm light across the village square. Elric sliced the first loaf and handed pieces to the children, then to Marta, then to the couple from the southern cottages, then to Tomlin. Last he took a piece for himself. It was warm, software just slightly sweet. He closed his eyes as he tasted it and felt something loosen in his chest. Not relief, not joy, but peace. A quiet knowing that spring would come and the village would rise with it, as it always had, as it always would. By early March, the river had found its voice again. What began as a hesitant trickle had grown into a steady murmur. Cool, clear water carving its way through softened earth, pushing past thawed banks and stones once buried in ice. Elric stood at its edge one morning, boots caked in mud, watching the water pass. There had been a time, not long ago, when this river froze solid, when its stillness felt like a kind of judgment. But now it moved again, freely, without apology. It reminded him of something ancient, something quiet but certain. He crouched, dipped a cupped hand into the current, and drank. The chill bit his tongue. It tasted clean. Back home, Marek was already up, gathering fallen twigs from the yard. The boy had taken to waking before his siblings, without being asked, and tending to small chores. He moved like someone who understood purpose. They didn't speak much that morning. There was no need. Inside the house, Anith laid out cloth strips for mending, worn sleeves, old tunics, last year's sackcloth. She worked with calm diligence, pausing only to stretch her aching fingers. The children played nearby, their laughter bouncing softly off the walls. Elric mixed a fresh batch of dough, using the most recent flour from Tomlin's mill. It was finer now, the stones turning more easily with a thaw, and the result was smoother, lighter, easier to shape. He caught himself humming an old tune as he needed. It had no words, just a rhythm, a pulse. That afternoon, word came from the edge of the forest. The wild onions had returned. Not many, not large, but green. Elric took Marek with him, following narrow footpaths softened by sun and rain. The snow had vanished beneath the trees, replaced by wet leaves, moss, and the smell of life pushing upward. They knelt near a bend in the trail and found them, thin shoots, sharp with scent. Marek grinned and pulled a few carefully, placing them into a woven basket. On the way home, they passed the old marker stone, the one carved generations ago to mark the border of the first barley field. Elric paused. He ran his hand along its surface, worn smooth by weather and time. "I planted here once," he said quietly. "Long ago." Marek looked up. "Will you plant again?" Elric smiled. "Number, but you might." That evening, as the sun fell low and gold spilled through the cracks in the shutters, they added the onions to a barley porridge. The scent was sharp and sweet, filling the house like spring itself had stepped through the door. They ate slowly, savouring every bite. After the children slept, Elric sat by the hearth with Anith, the fire flickering low. "I think we'll plant early this year," he said. She nodded. "The ground will be ready soon." He took her hand, rough and warm, and held it without speaking. Outside, the river kept moving, and far above them, the stars began to return, one by one, soft, familiar, and full of promise. The sun rose earlier now. Not by much, just a breath sooner, just enough to catch the frost before it melted. But it was enough for the village to take notice. Windows opened a little wider in the morning. Cloaks were worn a little looser, and the fields, once buried beneath feet of snow, began to breathe again. Elric stood near the edge of the barley plot, a small wooden spade in hand. The earth was still damp, clinging to his boots and fingernails, but it gave way under pressure, soft and rich, full of the scent of decay and life. Marek worked nearby, scattering compost they'd saved from last season, bits of straw, crushed ash, and vegetable peelings. The boy was focused, determined, not in haste, but with care. "Not too thick," Elric called softly. "Let the earth breathe." Marek nodded, adjusting his handfuls, letting them fall like a fine layer of promise. They would begin planting within the week. That afternoon, Elric visited Marta. She was in her yard, hanging strips of washed linen to dry on a rope strung between two posts. A soft wind fluttered the cloth like flags of surrender and survival. "The lambs are feeding now," she said. "All four." Elric smiled. "You'll need more pasture." She nodded, already cleared the eastern slope. They stood together in silence for a while, watching the sky. Thin clouds drifted above like whispers, pale and harmless. "I brought you this," Elric said finally, handing her a small wrapped bundle. Inside, a slice of bread, baked that morning, still warm at the center. Marta took it gently. "Thank you." Back at the cottage, Aneth had started preparing for planting season. She emptied the storage bins, cleaned the woven baskets, laid out sacks for new grain. Her movements were swift but thoughtful. Years of practice had turned her preparation into a kind of quiet choreography. That night, after the children had gone to bed, Elric sat by the fire, his feet stretched toward the warmth. Marek joined him, bringing a book. It was old, worn leather cover, cracked spine, pages smelling of dust and age. It had been given to Elric by his father, and before that, to his father by a travelling monk who once traded scripture for shelter. The book wasn't about farming or bread. It was filled with stories, folk tales, old verses, forgotten wisdom from lands far beyond their little village. "Read one?" Marek asked. Elric nodded. The boy turned pages slowly, carefully, until he found one he liked. He began to read. His voice was soft, uncertain at first, but steady. The words rolled out like a stream at first thaw, cool, sure, curious. Elric closed his eyes, not to sleep, but to listen. As the fire crackled and the night deepened, the two of them stayed there, father and son, story and silence woven together. Outside, the wind rustled the dry grass, and somewhere near the forest's edge, a fox called out, not in hunger, but in greeting. Spring finally arrived, not with fanfare or sudden colour, but with slow, quiet certainty. The ground was soft now, even warm in places. Birds had returned in full chorus. Their songs wove through the village at dawn, blending with the creak of doors, the splash of water from the well, and the low murmur of voices that no longer carried winter's weight. Elric walked to the field with Marek at his side. The boy carried a sack of barley seed over one shoulder, his step steady. There was still a boyish looseness in his stride, but it was shrinking day by day, replaced by something older. The field was ready, carefully tilled, lined by hand, the soil loose and dark. Elric knelt, scooped a handful of earth, and let it sift between his fingers. "This land remembers," he said, "every year, every season, every foot that's walked it. Ours, theirs, even the ones before us." Marek said nothing, but he knelt too, and together they began. Seed by seed, row by row, there was no rush. They worked with the sun, pausing when the breeze grew strong, sipping water from a shared flask. It wasn't labour, it was rhythm. The same rhythm that had fed generations. The same slow patience that brought bread to the table, warmth to the hearth. By midday, others had joined. Tomlin, with his sleeves rolled and hands dusted in flour. The young couple from the south end, passing baskets of seed to the children. Even Marta, her face creased and calm, walking between rows to check spacing, her fingers brushing the earth like an old friend. Aneth brought a small meal to the edge of the field. Bread, wild onion stew, and a jar of last summer's cherries preserved in syrup. They ate together, not in celebration, but in quiet recognition. They had survived, and now they would begin again. That evening, as the sun dipped low, casting gold across the damp soil, Elric stood alone at the far edge of the field. He looked out over the rows, straight, clean, waiting. Behind him, laughter spilled from the cottages. A dog barked, a pot clanged against stone. But out here, it was still. He closed his eyes, let the warmth of the fading light wash over his face. Memories rose, of his father's voice in early spring, of his mother humming near the oven, of the first loaf he had ever shaped with his own hands. They were all here, still part of the soil, still alive in the work. He opened his eyes, turned toward the village, and walked home with a calm heart. Tomorrow would come, and with it, the first green shoots. A week passed, then two. The barley shoots appeared slowly, almost shyly. Thin, bright green blades rising from the black soil like cautious whispers. The children were the first to spot them, racing barefoot through the field's edge, their laughter trailing behind like wind through leaves. Marek brought Elric to see them at dawn. "Here," he said, crouching low, pointing. "They're through." Elric knelt beside him, brushing the earth with careful fingers. He didn't speak. He only smiled. It was the kind of smile that didn't need words, the kind worn by men who had lived long enough to recognize the miracle in small, ordinary things. The shoots were fragile now, barely taller than a thumb, but they danced in the wind. They would grow if tended. They would rise. By late spring, the village was alive again. Doors stood open. Breezes flowed through window slats. The smell of smoke no longer meant fear or hunger, but meals being prepared, bread baking, life moving forward. In the square, someone had carved a new bench from a fallen ash tree. Children gathered there in the afternoons, listening to stories from old Marta, who had rediscovered her voice along with the season. Marek had taken to writing in the evenings, small notes, observations, sketches of plants, thoughts that had nowhere else to go. He kept them in a folded packet of parchment near his bedside. One evening, he gave a page to Elric. It read, "Today I planted my own row. You watched but didn't correct me. That's how I knew I was ready." Elric kept it tucked in the same book his father once passed down. The stories remained, as they always did, and so the days continued, not grand, not easy, but steady. In the mornings the oven glowed warm. In the evenings the fields turned gold in the setting sun. One day, perhaps years from now, Marek would take his own son or daughter to the river, to the edge of the barley field, to the marker stone near the woods. He would tell them of a winter long past, of mud huts and smoked hearths, of silence and hunger, and the way bread once rose again after the coldest season. He would speak softly, he would speak truth, and the child would listen. And then, together, they would plant.